Hey, everybody. I am essentially going to tell you about the stuff that we cover in Docu-gaming. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the lecture that I typically give in class. And I say lecture, but really most of it is saying, here's a bunch of games. I think they're really cool. I want you to think about what they're doing. Right? That's the idea. Okay, so let's do that now. Uh, okay, the idea of docu-gaming is essentially this. You'll notice that it sounds like documentary, right? That's part of the idea. I mean, documentaries are about the real world. And the idea is that these are games that are in some way about the real world. Right? I didn't know what exact name to give them. Sometimes document gaming is used. Um, Sometimes I say game meets world, right? But that was the idea. All right, so I want you kind of think about this as whenever you have actually a work of art that touches on the real world, a lot of times you can have controversies. So this is the most commercially successful documentary film of all time, Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. It tried to argue that George Bush was in many ways um, I don't know if responsible for 9/11, so probably not responsible in any way, but badly handled the Iraq War. And we should not have been in Iraq in the first place. And it was essentially arguing that he was not qualified to lead and should not be reelected. Right? Lots of people essentially accuse this film of being very one-sided and cherry picking its facts, right? And when you want to present what the truth is about the world, cherry picking your facts means that you're only presenting the facts you like and you're misleading people. And that's a lot of times the really big issue in a lot of these, right? So take Selma, which was essentially trying to talk to people about uh, educate people about the struggle for civil rights in America. The March in Selma was an extremely important part of that. And it essentially wanted to get the message out there and educate Americans and people all over the world about this. But then they decided to essentially take the figure of President Johnson, and they felt like they needed more of a villain. So they vilified President Johnson, who was more or less a pretty strong supporter of civil rights at the time. And when asked about this, the director essentially said, "Hey, look, I'm just making a movie here. I'm trying to make my movie entertaining and watchable." But for everything else in the movie, what they were so proud of were the realism, right? So what are they doing here? Are they going for realism or are they just trying to make a good story? If you're trying to educate people about the world and you're giving off that impression, then when you're miseducating them, many people have a problem with that for very good reason. Right? Then you have movies like American Sniper, and I thought American Sniper was a really interesting attempt at trying to come up with a movie. The movie is based on a book about I think written by the most lethal sniper in American history. I think this guy killed over 400 people as a sniper in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's a tough story to tell. This is coming during the Iraq War. It's still happening. Um, on the one hand, are you going to essentially like glorify this killer? I mean, which is, what he is. Did this person really only kill insurgents, or did he kill innocent people? I mean, so many innocent people were killed by the Americans during Iraq and Afghanistan. So is this whitewashing it? Or, on the other hand, are you taking essentially a man who was willing to dedicate his life and maybe sacrifice his life, for his country and to liberate Iraq from its brutal dictator? And are you going to vilify him as like a murderer? You see how that's a hard line to walk? And every time you're dealing with reality, right, it is a hard line to kind of to walk. Right? How do you get that right? How do you balance essentially respect for everybody involved with the truth? Right? And how do you make it interesting enough for people to pay attention? Right? Okay, so to do this, we're going to talk about a variety of games that are really I put them in kind of different categories. They're not like perfect categories, but here's the idea. First, we have like training games, and training games are exactly what they say. So here's a report about this is old, but it does the job.
I know what it looks like, but I'm not playing video games right now. I'm actually working. And today I'm out at the 254's Virtual Interactive Training Lab, taking a look at some new state-of-the-art technology that's providing our troops with a new cutting-edge way to train up.
All right, incoming! We're shooting across the street up to the doorway. Everybody follow me.
The future of basic and combat training is here at Fort Benning.
Virtual Interactive Combat Environment is a system for training team tactics, techniques, and procedures. It's a live training environment where you're able to go in and actually do maneuvers and do fire at the same time.
All the things that I'll see in theater, I can load onto this computer or onto the system and use squad integrated weapons to train here.
The Virtual Interactive Combat Environment, or VICE, gives instructors the ability to conduct any type of training virtually, whether it's basic training fundamentals or more complex battlefield operations.
It does everything from squad tactical training, pull up a range if I want. I can do indoor ranges, outdoor ranges. I can do enter and clear rooms, buildings, urban operations. I can do woodland, desert, pretty much you name it. Tactical site exploitation, checkpoint operations.
Each student is able to individually maneuver and communicate and shoot within the environment based upon their own decision making. That you truly can have team maneuver and communication and decision making training with.
Okay, you get the idea, right? Obviously this is old, but this is, done all over the world now. Here's another one. So this is a game that essentially tries to educate you about fake news. And the way it does it is essentially by putting you in a position where it's training you to get your account popular by using various ways to convey to make fake news to get more followers, right? And in putting you in the position of training you to make fake news, the idea is then you will understand how it is that fake news work and how people get credibility along with it. And along the way, it's supposed to show you things like polarization.
Very briefly, deflection means you're fake news, essentially, when you're deflecting blame and trying to launch a counterattack.
Right, it has you make memes, it has you make fake articles, it has you essentially do lots of things in social media that will increase your followers. I used to use it in my critical thinking class, and I thought it was really great. It was developed by University of Cambridge, I think. Okay, then you have games that are empathy games. And empathy is essentially your ability to feel what another person is feeling, right? And put yourself in their shoes. And these games try to do that, right? So Dysphoria, for example, is, you can see it's a simple game, right? But it tries to essentially put you in the right, so autobiographical game about my experiences with hormone replacement therapy, right? Essentially, it's supposed to get you to get a better understanding of what it's like to be trans and the challenges that someone would face if they are trans. Right? And it's based on the game designer's personal experience being trans. All right, we'll go on to the next one. Okay, this is Depression Quest by Zoe Quinn, which is essentially about depression, right? So again, it's trying to get you to think what it's like to have depression. And it's a text-based game. And one of the thing about it that's really interesting is that, essentially it's putting you in a position of, being depressed, and it gives you options to choose what to do. And notice that some of these options are crossed out, right? They're just not available to you. And the reason they're not available to you is because depression just stops you from doing it. And the options that it's really stopping you from doing are the healthy options, right? The options that really would be good for you. And it's trying to help you understand why it's just so hard to live a good life when you're depressed, right? All right, I'm going to move on to educational games. Now, when you think of educational games, typically what you think of as, kids learning math, and those are educational games. But the way I want you to think about it is educational games are actually about the world itself, right? And a lot of times the way this would work is that they're trying to educate you on something historical, right? So, for example, so this is the Cat in the Coop from 2011, which follows the life of Dr. Mohammed Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran, until essentially the Iranian government was brought down by the CIA and MI6, where they installed essentially the Shah, sort of a king in Iran instead of their parliamentary system, in order to get more access to Iran's oil. This is what later on leads to the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and their current theocracy and their current anger and hatred of America and England. I mean, it's done as a really beautiful artistic game using kind of a Persian art where essentially it's a puzzle game and you play as the cat, you play as this cat, and you do that essentially to move the story forward. And as the story moves forward, it's essentially giving you a perspective of what happened and how tragic it is that it did happen the way it happened. Right? Then you have Black Friday is essentially about the revolution. So we have another one about Iran to try to understand just what happened then. And here, so you play as a photographer essentially, but I'll show you the trailer here.
It all began in the summer of 1978 in Tehran, Iran. John Travolta, Bobo has nothing on me. My heart is taking not choosing sides.
The plans, we need to go now.
I'm a photographer.
No. Oh, you say something.
Let's just get the sort of
Hi, Mr. June. You weren't a part of that craziness today, were you?
All right, so notice what's happening here, right? You play as essentially a photographer, someone who doesn't really have a stake in what's going on, but you're in the middle of the revolution, and it puts you, the player, in the middle of this incredibly globally important, still very much today, globally important event, and really uh, an event that has shaped the nation and is an incredibly interesting historical event to be a part of, right? And if you're in it, you can get it, right? So notice how that's part of the educational aspect of it. All right, the last one here is the game called Peacemaker, and Peacemaker is, I think, one of my favorite all-time documentary games or docu-games. It's a political game. And political games are really, really hard to do, unless you're doing a fantasy political game or an alternative universe political game. The idea essentially here is that the world's thorniest challenge is what to do about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And in this game, put together by a team of Israeli, Palestinian, and American developers, essentially tries to uh, get you to make peace while playing as either the Israelis or the Palestinians. And here's how it works. The developer, the lead developer here is an Israeli, is one of the people that really speaks for what games could be. He goes around the world and talks up what video games can do for the world.
Peacemaker is a game in which you take the role of one of the leaders. You can take either the role of the Israeli Prime Minister or the Palestinian president. You can play both perspectives. And the idea is that as the leader, you have to react to real-time events happening in the world. You can negotiate with other leaders, but you also have security or military actions that you can take. And by doing so, you have to reach a peaceful solution while in office.
In an Israeli high school, a new computer game called Peacemaker was launched today. Children playing the role of Israeli and Palestinian leaders trying to make peace in a virtual world of suicide bombings and Israeli military strikes.
We don't expect to address all issues of the conflict. We don't expect to give all the answers. We're bringing up issues for discussion.
The best aspect of playing this game is that, especially if you're a Palestinian student in the territories or an Israeli student within Israel, you get a chance to really feel what both sides are thinking and get a better sense of what they can do together to work towards peace.
If you look at the video game industry today, there are so many games out there about violence, about war, about destructions. We say a simple thing: there is certainly a place for one little game about peace.
What I found really interesting about this game is that it did give you the opportunity to role play on both sides. And this is something that almost nothing lets you do, right? Both sides are very entrenched in their view of the world. When you play for the other side, you now have your own view of the world, right? You're not really following the view of the world that is in sorry, let me say that again, right? Both sides understand their view of the world for the most part, right? They don't really understand the other side. So when I played this game, in about an hour, the first time I won, I managed to make peace, right? I felt great about myself. Wow, look, it's not that hard, right? I played it a second time in a different mode as Israel and also managed to make peace, right? Then I went and played as the Palestinians. And I had an intifada on my hand in like 15 minutes. It was super hard. It was so interesting, the limitations of what you could do as the Palestinian leader. The different stakeholders that you had to deal with that I wasn't as aware of as someone originally from Israel. The difficulty of all of it was just really, really interesting. Now, I gave it to a friend of mine to play, who is big in the Jewish community in LA. And after 15 minutes, she lost, and she said, this game is bullshit. It just makes assumptions that are just wrong, like you can trust Palestinians. And this is really the problem, the challenge of a game like this, right? A game like this makes assumptions, political assumptions, right? Assumptions that people on both sides, a general in the US, in the Israeli army played it and said the same thing, right? If you disagree with the assumptions of the politics in question, it's just not going to work for you, right? So that part itself is really interesting. Anytime you make a game about the real world, you're going to make assumptions about what the real world is, right? And those assumptions are going to often be controversial assumptions. For example, imagine someone makes a game right now about immigration in the United States, right? It's going to make certain assumptions about what immigration in the US is like. And conservatives have dramatically different ideas about actually immigration is like than liberals do, right? So which perspective are you going to use it from? Or are you going to try to combine both perspectives? Notice how hard that is. Right? All right, so this is something to really, really keep in mind. I want you also to notice the number one, whenever you make something about the real world, you're making assumptions, and you got to make sure you're aware of your assumptions. Right? Number two, you got to be essentially sensitive to the parties involved. Notice that this game essentially, as consultants, talked with both Israelis and Palestinians to get the information that they needed. Everybody was involved in the game, right? That allows you also to be more sensitive to every side. The third thing I really loved about this game is the videos. So these real videos, right? To bring home to you, like, hey, look, this is really happening, and you need to make decisions that will impact potentially millions of people about how it is that you're going to respond to them. So I thought that was really, really great. Okay, the next thing is activist games. And activist games, they don't just try to, let's say, teach you about something, they try to get you to do something about it, right? So my favorite is Darfur is Dying. So this was back in 2006, and a lot of games like this were being made in 2006 as game designers were really beginning to think of how games could do good in the world. And here is the idea. Darfur, by the way, was a huge humanitarian crisis where 3 million, I think, people in West Sudan that were more like Black Africans were being persecuted by Arab militias. And essentially, it was a big, big crisis. And this will tell you about the crisis, and you'll see its activist mechanisms.
Darfur is Dying is an online game that attempts to put the player in the shoes of one of the 2.5 million refugees who are struggling to survive in the Darfur region of the Sudan. Players learn about some of the challenges refugees and displaced persons face, as well as how to take action that can help stop the crisis. The player leaves the relative secure confines of the camp in order to find water in the desert landscape. It speaks of children who bear the responsibility of foraging for water because their chances of survival are deemed greater if captured by the Sudanese militias, as women are routinely raped while foraging essentials for their families, and men face a high risk of being murdered. Should your avatar not succeed, you can try again. You must choose another of the remaining 7 avatars, however, as your previous one has perished. In the camp space, you can view testimonials of other displaced persons now living in shelters alongside your avatar, and you must harvest food and build shelters to sustain the camp, all the while mindful that a threat of an attack on your community by Sudan's militia is ever present. You can help maintain a low threat level by communicating with your social network. The more friends you invite, the better the chances of virtual survival. To further lower the threat level, you can write letters to President Bush and petition your representatives in Congress to support legislation that aids the people of Darfur.
Okay, so notice, right, how much activist elements they have in here, right? Not only are they educating about it, not only are they essentially telling you this is terrible, but they're giving you in-game opportunities to contact your representative, to contact George Bush, and I believe also to, who was president at the time, I believe also to contact militia. And if you tell people, right, any of these things help you advance in the game as well, right? So the more people you tell about this, right, the more you do well in the game. So they're combining activism and essentially success with the game.
While unrealized in the final development of the project, the third and final level of the game's research and design incorporates multiplayer cooperative gameplay based on the rebuilding of a village via the harvesting of crops by the community of Darfuri avatars. Additionally, this cooperative gameplay incorporates a design based on the group effort required to organize a divestment campaign in the player's student campus. According to server traffic numbers, 1.2 million people played the game within the first year of its launch, and tens of thousands participated in the activist tools woven into the gameplay. For a growing number of people, gaming is a logical medium for rigorous communication and social outcome, with the unique affordances that agency in games makes possible, such as embodied experience and self-realization, together with the affinity that the player community experiences, distances may be shortened both physical and ideological.
Okay, so that last part that they said that they were planning to do, this idea of essentially allow you to play in multiplayer mode where you actually meet people is brilliant. I really wish they would have done that, right? You're playing a game. The game is essentially about a real ongoing crisis. You can meet people and then join together to essentially do something about it. That's really amazing to me. And there's other games that are more so these are both from the same person, but essentially they try to put you in a situation, kind of like the educational games, but they're ongoing situations. And I think that's really kind of the difference. So this is about Guantanamo prison called Gone Gitmo in 2007.
Everything you're about to hear when you put on these virtual reality goggles and when you walk through the space really happened. We make these pieces because we can put you on scene.
And this is an early VR game.
To an actual event. You're not separated by a television or a screen, or you actually feel like you're there.
Noni de la Peña is the inventor of a new form of journalism that brings the news as a virtual experience based on real facts. That's what really gives journalism impact, says de la Peña.
So what you're looking at here is a virtual Guantanamo Bay prison experiment. So this is a exact replica of the plane that detainees were taken to Guantanamo Bay prison. As you go into the plane, suddenly we take control of you, show that you've been strapped down, and then the hood, just like the detainees described, this hood was pulled over their eyeside. Shut up! And once the hood is removed, you find you're inside a replica of one of the camp X-ray cages. I was very careful to create the models according to very close replicas of what the cages really look like. The reason we picked virtual reality was because the real prison is inaccessible to most citizens and press. And I think you get the sense of the bleakness of the environment much better than if you're looking at photographs. Once you start moving around it and you see these cages, I think it has a more impactful way to understand the facts that are going on. Immersive journalism was born out of this concept that perhaps we could tell stories that are inaccessible to most people using virtual reality.
And just to let you know, this was in 2007. Guantanamo prison is still open, still operating this way. Okay, another one she did was with Syria, and this is while Syria was happening, while the civil war in Syria was going on.
Third of all Syrians have been displaced by the war. Reports indicate children have been specifically targeted in the violence. There are now over 1 million refugee children. Food supplies are severely strained, and the number of refugees has been growing exponentially.
Now, in this world, you can move around, right? But they're showing you. So notice, right? This is an ongoing crisis. They're trying to get you interested in the crisis by putting you in a world where you are sharing that crisis, right? and giving you some sort of objective in the world. This is from so Revolution Our Times is a game that was made during the Hong Kong protests in 2019. Essentially, a huge part of Hong Kong, like a where like I think half the country or something like that, were protesting in marches to preserve democracy in Hong Kong, going against the Chinese government here. They failed. But this is one game that essentially was trying to kind of do that. It was a text-based game, but that also kind of showed you what was going on, and had you essentially play someone working essentially to preserve democracy in Hong Kong. And as it was doing that, and as you were making choices in the game, you can essentially buy through microtransaction things for your player that would actually, and your money would actually go to help provide legal fund for any protesters that were arrested. Okay, then you have games that just engage with the real world. That was the only category I found for them, right? That they just engage with the real world. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a few here. We're gonna start with That Dragon Cancer. So That Dragon Cancer was essentially, it's a movie about a kid getting cancer. Sorry, a game about a kid getting cancer. Your kid getting cancer. And it was made by a game developer whose young kid got cancer and died, and it's a super emotional game. It got a lot of media attention. It sold quite well. And yeah, and it's very artsy. Here it is. Bill plays building blocks with the cows. Bill faces the horse and Farmer Bill wins. The show is run time.
Cups, bathtubs, and the warm wet tongues and the cool fur of daws. Maybe the sweet was a daily affection.
Do you know how they celebrate off treatment day, like when kids are done with their treatments? I guess maybe you don't because you're not in the clinic as much as I am, but on someone's last day, they always bring them a cake and they sing happy off therapy day to you.
I'm sorry, guys. It's not good.
Basically, he thinks we should move forward with the radiation, and it kind of freaks me out, but it could be another miracle.
There's a story in the Bible where Jesus and his disciples are in a furious storm hits the sea, and everyone thinks they're gonna die. What Jesus is? He's asleep in the back of the boat.
I gotta say, I played that game. My son was like 6 months old. It was really hard. But it's really beautiful for what it does. All right. Next is, so this video is essentially about how, again, the importance of perspective, right? On what you're doing. So you'll see this stuff is old, but essentially you get the same you get the same situation talked about or gamified in two different ways, from two different perspectives.
Video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in the very popular war games, a common scenario turns the player into an imaginary US soldier shooting down groups of Arab terrorists. But there's a digital backlash brewing in the Middle East, where programmers are creating games from the opposite perspective. Galit Elat is the director of the Israel Center for Digital Art. Her exhibition, Forbidden Games, brings together video games from radically different ideologies.
Most of the game developed with a West perspective. So the terrorists is always Arabs, the bad guys are Arabs, the good guys are or Americans, European or Israelis. And they develop different games that the children can identify themselves with the heroes, which are Arabs and not Americans.
The most violent games are to be found in the bomb shelter underneath the building. The Night of Bush Capturing is a direct adaptation of an American game called The Quest for Saddam. The player takes on the role of an Arab fighter entering a US military camp, shooting American soldiers and attempting to capture President Bush.
I'm killing Americans. And I think I'm part of Al Qaeda forces. I'm more interested in the ideological aspect behind the games and less about the experience itself. This is the reason that the games are here. Oh, somebody killed it.
Special Force is a game developed by Hezbollah. It begins with a training camp where players practice shooting on the portraits of Israeli leaders. Then they go out and fight Israeli soldiers in South Lebanon.
From what I heard, it's a hit in Ramallah. A lot of young people playing this game.
I'm coming to this
Yes. I'm not for these games. For me, they are forbidden. But still, I open it to the public, you know, because one can't find part of the game here in the market. One have to explore or find them in Ramallah or in other places to have other sources to get the games. So in a way, I open up something that I think it's forbidden.
She doesn't mean literally forbidden. It's not like you can't get it, but it's viewed badly by her society.
Palestinian uprising or Intifada. A game from Syria called the Stone Throwers centers on a lone Palestinian demonstrator who throws stones at waves of Israeli soldiers. On the other hand, a game from Israel called Intifada shows a single Israeli soldier facing many Palestinian demonstrators.
And think how much it's easy to push the button, you know, when you are sitting in a tank or in an airplane, how much easy it is to push the button to shoot someone through the screen. I think it's almost the same feeling that you have here. You don't communicate, you don't see face, you don't see eyes. You just push the button. If we want to live in the Middle East, we have to communicate with our neighbors and to understand the culture and the motivation, and to have more, it's not open environment, but more understanding. And this is what we're trying to do as a culture.
Okay. So again, notice this idea, right? She starts with all these, games where it's mostly Americans killing Arabs. And there was very little reflection on that when those games were made. That, hey, look, everyone we're killing is just Arabs. What message are we sending? What perspective are we just assuming is universal, right? And every time you make a game where you're thinking about the world, you want to acknowledge that you are essentially doing this from a very particular perspective. All right, now we're going to end this with super controversial real world games. That's kind of the category I have for this. And I have two games here to share with you. Essentially, both are really interesting for what they're doing. The first one is called Freedom, and it's really old. It's from 1992. It was published essentially by the people who did the Oregon Trail, and the Oregon Trail was very, very successful. It was from an actual state program from Minnesota. The game itself, Freedom, was made for the Apple II for educational purposes, and at the time, Apple IIs were really commonly placed in schools. In it, essentially, the player assumes the role of a runaway slave in the antebellum South, who's trying to reach the North through the Underground Railroad. And the game was made to be used in school curriculum when it was first released in late 1992. And it really was trying to break new grounds, right? This idea of making a game about a serious topic way back then, and on a topic as difficult to talk about as slavery. Right? Essentially, here is what you see on the left what it looks like, and here's kind of the inspiration of it, right? So you had essentially in the late 1980s this activist named Kamuk Kumbai, who essentially was running a live action role play event based on the Underground Railroad. So these would be like reenactments. So you can see the photo on the bottom left, right? Essentially, it would be like an all-night thing, and it would walk you or run you through what it would be like to be a fugitive slave trying to escape through the Underground Railroad. They met. He met with the mech designer, Rich Bergeson, and Bergeson was talking to Cumbo, and he was like, "Wow, this would be a really, really cool idea if we did the same thing with a video game, kind of like we did with the Oregon Trail. That was about a historical event. This is a historical event, and just like he's doing a reenactment, we could kind of do a reenactment through a video game." So this guy through the fact that they met, this guy, Kumboy, became the game's primary consultant, right? And he influenced essentially how things looked, the way people talked, etc. The gameplay itself was essentially like this, right? And notice, right, it's mostly text, right? It's mostly text here, and you have some options that you can do, but you choose one or two characters. It could be male or females, and then you get a bunch of random attributes, and one of those is literacy, right? And different characters have different experiences. And if your player's character was illiterate, then you wouldn't actually be able to read, so written signs would be indecipherable. Just to kind of, let you know how hard it is, right? If you're a slave growing up in the South, living in the South, and you don't know how to read because you're not allowed to learn how to read, and then you have signs that tell you where to go, but you can't read those signs, right? That would be a big deal. It's very, very hard to actually escape. So your journey to freedom will require you to overcome a near endless stream of slave patrollers with dogs, slave patrollers with lanterns, and you always need water. It's very hard to find water. And you're also tasked with managing your nutrition, health, stamina, as well as keeping track of which direction you're headed. Okay. So far, this might sound good, right? And notice how it reads here, right? It's 1830. You're an enslaved African American in the South. When one of your grandfathers was young, he was kidnapped and brought to America. Your other grandfather was a free black man who was forced into slavery after he was accused of breaking the law, which he didn't do. Your grandmother's mother was enslaved in Africa and taken to Jamaica, where your grandmother was born. Your other grandmother came from a family of indentured servants who worked in Virginia farms in 1619, the year before the Mayflower reached Plymouth Colony. Okay, so notice it gives you, in this case, what I think is really interesting, kind of a background of which could be typical to different slaves, right? And it's trying to give you the full story instead of just saying, here's a slave. Okay. Other things. After choosing your starting location, Freedom presents you with a brief biography. We talked about that, right? And an opportunity to visit the elders, right, in the plantations. And they essentially are where you can get your equipment, food, tips about your journey. And the elders speak in a dialect and their appearance often resembles racist caricatures of African Americans, or at least so the criticism went. Notice the dialogue, right? I don't really know how to read the kun. Help me, but do you have anything that can, the idea is that they're incapable, they have the broken English, that they can't speak what we would refer today as normal English. Right? Okay. Now, to prepare for this, and you can see the sign, right? The sign saying this because you can't read. So Robert Whittaker in 2020 essentially talked about this, and he said, reading the manual for freedom reveals both the earnestness of the developers, so how sincere the developers were in doing this really well, and how naive they were at what you need to do this well. They're convinced of the importance and potential benefit of the game, but they're also hopeful that the game will be played in an appropriate setting with guidance instructor. Okay, so what are they thinking? They're thinking, look, schools cover up slavery, and it would be really great if they gave students the ability to actually play as a slave and get some perspective on what it would have been like to escape as a slave and how the Underground Railroad worked. But in reality, what really happened is a bunch of teachers said, oh, great, we don't need to teach slavery anymore. We can just put them in front of a computer. And literally, that's what they did. They didn't read the manual. They didn't do anything like this. The manual was telling you how to fit it into your curriculum, right? Instead, they just plot them in front of the Apple IIs, and what you got was essentially the only introduction of slavery they're getting is from the game, right? Parents complained that the game was racially offensive and Nintendoized slavery. So Nintendo were big at the time, the first Nintendo game console. And they found both the appearance of the characters and the way they did their dialogue offensive. And this is mostly from Black parents. Okay, and they argued, right? So I kind of explained that this exposed their children to ridicule, and the Black parents threatened to sue. The Minnesota, I can't remember what they were called, the Minnesota, what exactly, but they offered to make changes. They were like, okay, let's pause. Okay, we realize now that this game isn't working the way we thought it was working. The guy that they relied on was not a really big expert. He was just a dude that claimed some expertise that were running these reenactments. They didn't actually do their research, and they didn't talk to African American studies professors and historians, people that really would have helped them avoid these kinds of things. Right? So essentially they said, okay, we're going to pull this out for a while. We're going to fix it. But at the end of the day, they decided they weren't really sure how to fix it, and they never brought it back. They didn't want to take the chance. It's a classic case of like really good intentions that really didn't work. Okay. The other one is, and really much more famous one, is 6 Days in Fallujah. And Days in Fallujah by Atomic Games, I think to me is one of the most interesting games that you've probably never heard of. So here's essentially what happens, right? So you got this Atomic Games that they were creating a lot of military simulation games, right? And to do that, they have a lot of military consultants, and a bunch of their consultants were Marines that came back from Iraq, and they were obviously, they were telling them all these stories of what it was like to actually be, in the war context. And at one point, Atomic thought, well, what would be really cool? If we actually use these real stories that were told that the Marines told us, to create a game that would translate to people who are not familiar with this, people who are so far away from the war, what it's like to really be in the war in Iraq. Right? And the Marines were very supportive of this, right? You can understand how it's hard to come home to 10,000 miles away to the United States and have no one understand what you've been through, right? And they thought a game like this would help people understand. All right, so they decided on a squad-based third-person shooter where players control Marines fighting insurgents in the Second Battle of Fallujah. Insurgents were essentially the name the Americans and their allies gave to the people they were fighting against in Iraq. It was recreated with the true stories from actual Marines who were at this battle, and they really wanted realism. Um, they tried to get that realism by interviewing 70 people. I mean, so they interviewed the Marines. They also interviewed Iraqi civilians, right, that were there. They tried to actually talk to insurgents. So they sent communications to groups that were fighting against the Americans to see if they could talk to them and get their side of the story, but they never really got responses. But good for them for trying. They talked to war historians and they talked to military officials. They announced the game in 2009, right? And right away, they are heavily criticized. 3 weeks later, Konami, who was going to publish the game, essentially says we're not going to publish it. And the game is never published. In 2020, I think, or 2021, a new company essentially was working on the game and announced that they were going to publish it. As far as I know, it still hasn't been published, even though they took a very, very different and much, much better angle to it. So here's what happened in the Second Battle of Fallujah. I mean, you have this joint British and Iraqi offensive in November and December 2004. The whole idea was, the Americans toppled Saddam Hussein, and now they wanted Iraq to have free elections that would be accepted by the people. But Fallujah is the second biggest city in Iraq, and it was held by the insurgents. They wanted these people to be able to vote, so they decided to clear the town. Right? It ends up being the bloodiest battle of the war and the bloodiest battle Americans have been in since Vietnam, which is saying a lot, right? You have 2,400 people being dead. Of that, only 100 are coalition forces, maybe 12 to 1,500 insurgents, and 800 civilians, right? Which is, a lot of innocent people dying. Also, the U.S. was accused of using white phosphorus as a chemical weapon during the battle, right? Which is banned under the Geneva Convention, I believe. Now, the battle itself was represented in other mediums. So, for example, there was a book here, No True Glory, what it was like to be there from the front lines. And they were going to do a movie about this starring Harrison Ford, right, which never ended up happening. But, they had no qualms about doing this. In 2009, the same year the game was released, there was a documentary film taken by footage mostly from the Marines, The Road to Fallujah. And in 2011, there was a game, but it was a board game about this, right? None of these raised any kind of fury. But when the 6 Days in Fallujah game came out, right, lots of people were really, really, really upset, right? And I want you to think here for a second why it was that a game like this, even given all the other mediums that this was done, why a game would be such a bigger deal to people, right? I want to say that some of it was just prejudice against gaming in general, right? You have a new media form that scares a lot of people that don't understand what this kind of media form is like. That's always a part of it. So it creates a moral panic. But besides that, you have what seems like a very reasonable assumption that you're not just passively watching something, right? You are engaging in something that is meant to be realistic and something that's also meant to inform you about reality. And that can be really, really, really different. In addition, this is happening during the war. So Tim Collins, former lieutenant colonel of the 1st Irish Battalion, essentially said this. It's much too soon to start making video games about a war that's still going on. And an extremely flippant response to one of the most important events in modern history. It's particularly insensitive when given what happened in Fallujah. Okay, so think about these ideas, right? The idea that this is too soon. Now, what does too soon mean? I've never been entirely clear about that, but I think you could take it in kind of two ways. One is people still have very strong emotions about this, and you don't want to push those people to make them feel really bad about what's happening. The other one is that too soon might mean that you don't really have the full picture yet, right? A lot of times, people think they understand what's going on, but it takes some years to really settle on what is actually happening. The idea of a flippant response is that by making a game, you're not taking seriously enough, right? And the insensitive part is that you need to be more sensitive in the way you're talking about it, so you're not hurting people, right? You can see this is from Karen Meredith, mother of a deceased lieutenant. So she's essentially her son died here, right? Says, I have this image of a bunch of guys sitting around laughing because they got killed or because they didn't get killed. Let's start over because we can, but my son couldn't start over. All right, so her son dies in this battle, and now it's a game where people get to do things kind of like her son, but live, but it's fun. But what about the tragedy of her son dying? Right? To her, this feels really disrespectful. And then you had Gold Star families, and Gold Star families are essentially the families in the United States who have had people in the military that have died in action, right? And they essentially said, for Konami and Atomic Games to profit off the deaths of people close to us by making it entertaining is despicable. Right? So notice this idea, right? People we care about, they died, and these people are making it into entertainment and making money from it. Now that sounds pretty bad, right? And it can be, but no one has said that about a movie that was made for profit about the war. Right? No one said that about the game that was made for profit that was not a video game. Right? Again, there's something about the interactivity of video games. There's something about our expectations of video games that really kind of goes further than this. Okay, so what I want to do is I actually want to walk you through how I would think about something like this if we were following the ABC model. Okay, so first of all, here are the facts. Okay? The game depicts real-world events where facts are disputed and potential for whitewashing exists. So one side said this happened, another side said this happened. And whitewashing means that you're essentially giving your version and ignoring the things that you don't want to be talked about. For example, the game might not have the US using white phosphorus, and people that played would assume that that never happened. Or the game might not involve the US actions killing any innocents, and that would make it seem like, the US did not kill innocents. And when I say the US, maybe that is also unfair. It's not just the US, it's, US, Iraq military, and British military. And it shows this event from a particular perspective. And that's really important, as we talked about earlier today, right? Or earlier in this video, right? This is a mostly American perspective with a particular set of American values. The people would be acting in the position of the soldiers killing the insurgents, right? And that's really important. You're giving them that position. You're not going the other way. You're not trying to liberate Iraq from the American invaders. And they would possibly be killing Iraqi civilians, right? If done poorly, this game could offend a range of stakeholders, as you saw from the comments, but not just Americans, which were all what the comments were about. I had a game design student whose girlfriend's uncle died in this battle, right? As a civilian, right? A bomb collapsed on his house and crushed him to death, right? How do Iraqis feel about this game, right? Taking place in their city, killing almost entirely their people. All right. Okay, so now let's get to stakeholders and stakes. Okay. First, we have the game designers, right? And what do they have at stake? They have their jobs and careers, right? We have players, can they enjoy themselves? Can they experience a real battle? Can they get educated about what happened during this battle? We have former soldiers, where, their experiences might be validated if other people essentially understand them, or maybe their experiences are being trivialized, right? And in fact, you might think of how having the experience trivialized might really affect you. For example, it might lead to suicide, right? If you're badly affected. And family members of these former soldiers are obviously also going to be a part of this, as well as Iraqis in general, right? The Americans are playing a game where the aim is to kill Iraqis, right? The ethical issues involved, right? Is this exploiting the suffering of others for personal profit? So we have a obligation not to exploit the suffering of others. Is that what this is doing? There's potential additional emotional stress or insult to those injured or killed in the battle, or other battles like it in Iran, and their families. We have an obligation not to hurt them. Is the game trivializing the actual horrors and misrepresenting, right? We have an obligation not to misrepresent what actually happened, nor to trivialize like terrible things. The potential for miseducation itself is a really big deal. And maybe this game, because the war is still going on, this could actually impact the ongoing relationships between all the groups involved. And that could lead to more people dying, right? If people are upset about this. So what options go with this? Here are the options I kind of thought of. So treat it like any other war game. This is from the perspective of the company. Regard its historicity or recent date as irrelevant. So just think about it as just a war game, and it doesn't really mean, you're not saying we're being realistic in any way. Conduct extensive research and interviews with stakeholders to ensure accuracy, in which case you are trying to make it like really about this particular battle. Do that, and also try to be really sensitive, right, to the interests of stakeholders. So when you're talking to people, gauge essentially what triggers for them, what things upset them, what they find offensive, so you could be more sensitive about it. Or four, just don't release the game at all. Here's how I thought through option one, right? So treat it like every other war game. You're risking emotional harm for soldiers, locals, and families. You're risking miseducating the public about what happened. And you potentially have a negative public reaction to this, as we saw happen, that could negatively impact sales. You're also rushing to tell a story before proper perspective is possible, right? And that could violate your obligation to tell the story well and truthfully. Maybe the fun game misrepresents genuine tragedy, and this is a tragic event that you're exploiting for personal gain. And the second option, so now you're doing these extensive interviews, you're still risking emotional harm, right? But you've got less risk. You're still risking misrepresentation, but it's much less. And due diligence reduces potential for negative public reaction, right? If you get it right, you're less likely to have a negative public reaction. But you still have these wrongs, right? Players are not miseducated, so you don't have that wrong because the designer's failure to properly research. Instead, you researched it, so they're getting correct education. The game will better represent genuine tragedy, but you still have the potential exploitation. And you still have these potential harms, but less so. If you also look for this whatever is offensive and sensitive to stakeholders, now you're further reducing the likelihood of emotional harm for all these people, and you're greatly reducing potential for negative public reaction. You still have potential for whitewashing the horror of the battle, but I think even that would be a lot less. Right? If you do this, players are not miseducated. You essentially still have a potential for misrepresentation, but again, it's less. And the tragic event might still be exploited for personal gain, but I would think the chances are a lot less for that. If you don't release the game at all, well, you got no likelihood of anybody being harmed, except the company, right? They're losing time and money, though they get to keep their reputation. In the real world, this game broke this company. Company had 75 people working on this game for 4 years, and at the end, when it was not released, they went bankrupt. The wrongs here, you have a duty not to unnecessarily harm people, and you met it, but you are reducing player autonomy. You're not letting players choose what to play, and you're depriving players of the choice of whether or not to experience the game. What should they do? I thought that this needed a lot of sensitivity to stakeholders. So that gets rid of 1 and 2. Option 4, I think, really misses the opportunity to respect player autonomy and maybe to educate the public, and maybe also to give people the ability to understand what it's like to be in situations like this, which are so important because the public that sends people to war like this ignores them. Option 3, I think, tries to do all the right things, but can actually do it well. I think if Atomic Games thought that it could really do it well, then that's the one they should have gone with. But if they had any concerns about its ability to do well, then really they shouldn't, and option 4 is better. Okay, now this has potential obstacles if you do this, right? So you're doing extensive research and trying to be sensitive. Parents of dead soldiers may be upset over the portrayal of their sons or daughters in the game is one obstacle. Another obstacle is that former soldiers might be triggered in negative ways, like, for example, the suicide or depression. And the game might be accused of being biased or racist. All 3 of these seem to me rather obvious obstacles that really Atomic Games should have prepared for. So strategies for overcoming these include Gold Star families, right? So these are families of dead soldiers as advisors in the process and demonstrate commitment to communicate the reality of their children's activities in a sensitive manner that would help others understand, and do the same with veteran groups and Iraqi groups, right? So essentially, you're getting the stakeholders involved, right? But you're getting them involved from the beginning. You're doing what they try to do with Peacemaker, right? You're getting them involved early in the process. They're a part of it, so that you don't get blindsided, and so that you give a fairer and more accurate and more sensitive depiction of what actually happened. Okay, so that's the idea. I want you to think of them as we head into making your own games. And I want to wish you good luck as you think in the third part of the class of how to make your games.